Welcome back to Sound 101. I'm Andrew from Deity Microphones, and today's episode is a masterclass all about EQ, the one topic you guys never asked for, but we're gonna do it anyway. Today we're going to be covering everything you guys need to know about EQ. We're going to start by talking about important terms so we know all the terminology needed. Then we're going to talk about technique using real software. And then we're going to actually be talking about hardware versus software to wrap the video up. And throughout the whole process during this video, we're going to be giving you plenty of samples so you can hear the difference before and after applying EQ. Now let's dive into a bunch of terms. And to do that, we actually need to add EQ to our track so we actually know what we're looking at. So let's go to Audio Effects. We're going to go down to where it says Filters and EQ. We're going to drop down and we're going to actually do a Parametric EQ. The reason for this is it's actually the most controllable, most manual override kind of EQ you can do out there. It's the best one also for beginners because you can also apply presets and actually visually see what you're doing. So now that we've actually applied our parametric EQ to our footage, let's take a look at what's actually on our screen because there's a lot of things going on here. And if you're not familiar with a lot of these terms, it can be very confusing. So we're actually going to start in the upper left-hand corner. You see master gain. This allows you to add gain to the whole scene. Master, right? On the right-hand side, we also see a gain system, which is decibels at the very top. You see the little metric system, and you see 0 dB in the dead center. What this means is if I go above 0 dB in any of these frequencies, I am boosting. If I am going below 0 dB, I'm cutting. Okay, so that's a gain structure system, much like you would in any other gain structure in your audio chain. What's going on down here, the bottom of our chart though, is frequencies. In Premiere, you can go from 0 hertz all the way up to 30,000 hertz. Now, you may not be familiar with 30,000 hertz, but musicians are. And if you're doing music and you're adding it and you did the recording yourself with some super beyond hearing frequency kind of microphones, you will actually have audios in those frequencies. They were captured, they're there. You can't hear them though, but you can feel them sometimes with a really good sound system. So let's actually take a look though at the actual chart itself. And I've got a line going across the center. This is called flat. Okay, it's right there at 0 dB. We've actually got 5 bands and 2 shelves. One is a high shelf and one is a low shelf. Let's take a look at the low shelf first though. So if I actually bring this down, you can see it's actually affecting all the frequencies behind it. Though if I've got it right now, I've got it all the way at like 1K, something that's not really a low shelf. It's really just an example of what we're looking at here. But you'll look at 200 hertz, the line kind of stops curving and really is flattened out. Everything behind it is evenly come down equal to that amount. So that is a low shelf. Let's take a look at the high shelf. It does the exact same thing, but for high frequencies. So anything that's kind of up in the upper scale is considered a high frequency. Anything in the lower scale is a low frequency. It's best to think about this in terms of, the car radio. You have your treble and you have your bass. Same thing, you have your lows and your highs. So that's what a low shelf and a high shelf are. Now let's talk about what a high pass and low pass are. So I'm gonna enable that band right there, high pass. You can see immediately it cuts it all off. And sometimes if I go into something like right here, 48 and the super deep octave, it's cutting it even faster. Now, I don't like to do that. I like to keep it like a 6. Or something like a 12, something more gradual. They like to call it a high pass in Premiere because of all these frequencies up here in this upper range are passing through the filter. They're not being affected. The rest of the world, we like to call this a low cut because we like to talk about the frequencies that are being affected. So just as the high pass is a low cut, the low pass is also a high cut. So let's actually take a look at what's right here in these bands though. So we have a 50, 200, 800, 3200, 12800, and a 16,732 hertz band. We can actually shift these, like I said, anywhere we want. So we can shift that up to 100 hertz if we want. We can shift the second band up to like 400. We can move these left and right, any kind of frequency you want. You can dial in exactly what you want. Now, what exactly are you dialing in? You're dialing in the amount of gain. So like, let's go to band number 1 and let's add something dramatic, like 5 decibels of gain. Well, all of a sudden you notice there's a bell-shaped curve that has now been added to our number 1 band. And the frequencies on the left and frequencies on the right have also been boosted, kind of to curve it all out and smooth out that boost. Well, that's called your Q. And our Q is currently set to 2. Now, if we set this Q to something dramatic, something like 10, you'll notice it's really super narrow. So now we have a narrow Q. And if I set this to something the exact opposite, like 0.5, you'll notice we have a super wide Q. And how much gain you want the left and right frequencies of your Q frequency to have is based on your Q setting. 1 is considered a neutral position, with anything below 1 widening it out, anything above 1 making it super tight and narrow. I'll show you later why you want a narrow frequency versus a wider frequency. And lastly, you'll notice we're able to actually toggle the band on and off by actually clicking this button. That's going to get rid of that band altogether. Why would you want to do that? Well, because you may be doing something very simple. So I'm going to turn off like half of these, and you'll notice I've got a low shelf, a high shelf, and just a number 3 band. That's a simple 3-band EQ now, and that's a really coarse way of doing general stuff in your edit. If you want to do something more detailed, more finite, bring all your bands back and you're going to be able to control everything you needed. Now that we know a lot of the terms in our Parametric EQ software, let's actually take a look at some techniques. I've got a file loaded up right here. Let's actually give it a little listen first. So on today's episode of Sound 101, we're going to do something that is probably the most important thing you can learn. So it's actually my voice, so we have a male human voice, and I'm going to turn on all of my parameters for this one. So we're going to actually go and start with a flat curve here. And the first thing I notice is a lot of bass in my voice. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to play with this low shelf right here. I'm just going to bring that down pretty dramatically. So now let's take a listen to what this is going to do. It's going to sound like garbage, but you get an idea as to what the actual parameter does in the Parametric EQ. So we'll cue up the clip again and let's hit play. So on today's episode of Sound 101, we're going to do something that is probably the most important thing you can learn. And just like that, I lost all puberty. So we're going to do the exact same thing, but for the highs. So let's bring those highs in, and we're just going to get rid of half the highs. Why not? So let's cue it back up and hit play. So on today's episode of Sound 101, we're going to do something that is probably the most important thing you can learn. So right there, you can hear a dramatic difference, and that is there's no highs, which means there's no clarity. So when we go back and listen to this, it's very muffled if you don't have those high frequencies. So again, we're just going to flatten our curve, and let's actually take a listen to this by doing some proper EQ. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to get rid of just a little bit of those highs. So I'm just going to bring down my lows just a little bit right there. And I'm actually going to bring up some of the highs in band number 4, right there around that 5 to 6K. That's where I really want it. So now let's give this a little listen. So on today's episode of Sound 101, we're going to do something that is probably the most important thing you can learn. And as you can see there, a lot of the muffleness in my voice, because I'm sometimes a microphone eater, I get a little too close. I play with that proximity probably a little bit more on the dangerous side. I brought it back a little of those clarity in the highs, and it really allows for this to really kind of punch through, and you can hear now exactly each individual word I'm saying in this clip. Let's actually go even more dramatic. Let's talk about how to do some corrective EQ. Let's say I actually had an air conditioner turned on. So air conditioners typically live somewhere around in this kind of range right here, just a little bit north of 60 hertz. And if I want to, I can get real technical, dial in exactly 60 hertz. So I'm actually going to add a very sharp notch filter. Usually the hum of an air conditioner is typically what your electricity is. So if you're in North America, 60 hertz. If you're in Europe, 50 hertz. It's very important to remember that kind of information. This also will be if you have an electrical hum from like a refrigerator, because it's got some kind of compressor that's kicking on and kicking off. The actual electrical cycles that the motor is going at matches your electricity, which matches the frequency of that electricity, which also matches the audible frequency of the sound, 50 hertz or 60 hertz. So we're at 60 hertz here in North America. Now I'm actually going to give this something super dramatic, like a negative 30 dB. Now you'll notice my frequencies just disappeared right there. That is terrible. I lost everything below 200 hertz. Why did that happen? Well, because my Q is not super narrow. So now let's narrow up the Q, so I'm only doing a sliver right there. So let's actually make the Q something like 15. But you can see that's still not enough, and I'm gonna really have to dial this up to like 55. And as you can see, where the air conditioner and the hum and all that stuff sits is completely gone. So now let's give this a little listen. So on today's episode of Sound 101, we're gonna do something that is probably the most important thing you can learn. And there you go. You didn't actually hear a lot of my voice being cut out because we're only cutting out the narrowest possible sliver needed to get rid of an air conditioner. Everything in the deeper part of my voice, the resonance of my voice, is below 50 hertz, and that's still being preserved. And anything above that frequencies in the 70 to 100 is also being preserved. So like the overall tonality of the lows in my voice are still there and punching through, but the actual air conditioner, we've notched that out. Now the reason why I want a wider Q when I'm actually boosting and a very narrow Q when I'm actually dropping frequencies is because it's more naturalistic. So like if I did a low cut and it was just everything below 100 Hertz just disappeared, that would sound really unnatural. Especially if I had something like the exact opposite, which is like a 4K boost with a real just high pitch kind of squeak in my voice coming through. It wouldn't sound anything like what my voice sounds like at all. So when you are kind of doing some EQ, a common phrase that you can just memorize and really kind of live your life by in the EQ world is cut narrow, boost wide. And if we go to our number 4 frequency over here, our 4 band, we've got it up in there. We're just going to dial this up to a nice even number 5,000. And we've got our Q still set to 2. And if I was to really kind of boost the highs here and really try to bring in that clarity, I may not make it as narrow as 2. Remember, that's the default by Premiere. I may do something, I don't know, probably like a 1, maybe even something like a 0.6, and maybe give it a more overall boost. So everything from like 2K up to 10K is getting boosted in these highs. They add that clarity. So again, let's give this a little listen to see what that new highs sound like. So on today's episode of Sound 101, we're going to do something that is probably the most important thing you can learn. And there we go. I mean, as you can hear, dramatically different than the way it first started. Now, if I want to actually go back and listen to what my raw audio sound like, you can bypass a filter. And in Premiere, it's this little power button up here in the right-hand corner. Now that we've gotten that all out of the way and we've talked about some of the options we have for corrective EQ, let's talk about creative EQ and what we can actually do. I'm going to start with one that's built right into Premiere, and that is old-timey radio. And as you can see, you can dramatically see the shift in our EQ bands and where they're actually placed all across. So let's actually give this now a listen. So on today's episode of Sound 101, we're going to do something that is probably the most important thing you can learn. And as you can see, the EQ kind of makes it sound like we're in a tin can. It really has cut almost a lot of the highs out. We've got, at some points, the actual high shelf is sitting at negative 20 dB with a 24 octave dB drop. The low shelf is actually completely untouched. And yet, at the same time, because the number 1 band has been so dramatically shifted down to negative 30 dB right in here, plus with a Q of 4, we are really dramatically just shifting our highs and lows down and really only leaving the mid-range 0.3 practically untouched here, but with a wider Q to only leave those frequencies behind. So old-time radio, if you're wanting to mimic it, it really didn't have the full frequency response. It only had a very narrow shift in the middle, but we can even make it more dramatic. So let's go back to default and let's actually play around with some fun ones. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the 1 point, I'm going to bring it dramatically down. I'm going to take the L and also bring that dramatically down. Bring point number 5 dramatically down, and H dramatically down. And it really is not even far enough because I'm going to add negative 30 to 1. I'm going to come over to point number 5 and I'm going to make this one negative 30. And I'm going to make a boost and I'm going to make my Q really wide because remember we want wide Qs. So I'm going to make my Q probably something like 0.5. And I'm going to actually add gain to point number 3, which is sitting dead center of our frequencies at 800 Hertz. And I'm going to make this something like 10 dB. So I've got this just mound right here in the middle of my frequencies. That's all that's left. Now let's give this a listen and you can tell me what you think this sounds like. So on today's episode of Sound 101, we're going to do something that is probably the most important thing you can learn. Now, why would I actually need to use EQ for something super creative? Well, it's because not all frequencies go through all objects. And let's think about something like a nightclub. You have that classic scene where the main actor in your movie is fighting with the bouncer because he can't get into a nightclub. Yet, we know it's a nightclub because we can hear the music, but not like we hear music, but like you would hear music outside of a nightclub. Well, you can do all that with EQ by only bringing in the bass frequencies. Because if you actually look, if you look at something like, say, a wall, bass frequencies are going to be the only thing going through the wall, and the wall will actually absorb and eat up all the high frequencies. So if you were to do a scene like this, you could EQ it where almost all the highs are completely gone, almost all the mids are completely gone, and all you have left is just some booming bass and that thumping kind of sound. And with all that, you would have your nightclub scene ready for your movie. Same thing can be done about explosions underwater. You've recorded this wonderful explosion, maybe you've downloaded this free explosion online, and it sounds wonderful, but clearly it was not underwater. You could even EQ it to sound like it's underwater. Now the big debate in audio, hardware versus software. What should you be doing with hardware, say at your microphone head, versus what you can do in software? And this is kind of a hard debate, and it's a very personal kind of decision for a lot of people. But know that in the location sound world, for filmmaking, for television, we do not do anything in terms of hardware. Usually, a lot of the higher end pro microphones may not even have these kinds of options, but you may use them if you do need them for something like a fast turnaround, like say an interview setup where it's going live in a few hours, like a TV news setup, or if you're doing something live on set and it's actually being broadcast in the moment and you need to do something, hardware is great for that. But if you've got post-production time, if you're going to edit a project, always rely on your software. There's so much more you can be done in software that you can't do with hardware. And once you do it in the hardware, you're kind of locked into what it sounds like, unless you want to do some heavy EQ work to fix it in post. So when you're actually shopping for a microphone, sometimes you'll see a lot of microphones advertise a bunch of fun features that are built in. They may not actually be necessary. Well, and that kind of wraps up what we're going to be talking about for the rest of this episode. And for that last take, we actually left the air conditioner on, and our boy Dylan, who our new editor is here at Deity, is probably going to have to be using a lot of our techniques in this episode to get rid of that air conditioner noise. So good luck, Dylan. AC finally turned off. Well, that wraps up our whole episode. At the end of this now, this masterclass should have taught you everything you need to know about EQ, whether or not you should be doing it in your hardware, not in your hardware, how to use it creatively, as well as how you can correct for some errors that were happening on your film set. If you like this kind of content, hit the subscribe button and follow it up with that bell for notifications so you find out every single week when we post brand new videos. We get these ideas from you guys down in the comment section, so dive down in there, drop your comment, tell us what you want us to make our next couple of videos about, and we'll try to get those things made for you. I'm Andrew from Deity Microphones. Thank you for watching.